I'm Marcus Chen 47, and for 3 years I thought I'd found my forever person. Last month Elena walked out of our engagement party in front of everyone, declaring she couldn't marry someone who'd never amount to anything. Her words cut deeper than any business failure I'd ever faced. She took the ring, the deposits, and my faith in love itself. What she didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something extraordinary, a tech empire, worth more than she could imagine. I'd kept my success hidden, testing whether she loved Marcus the man or Marcus the wallet. Turns out, I had my answer. 3 weeks later, my assistant called, breathless with excitement. Mr. Chen, Forbes just published their billionaire list. You're number 847. That afternoon, Elena's number appeared on my phone. She'd seen the list. If you've ever wondered whether love can survive deception from both sides, stay with me. The Ritz-Carlton ballroom had never felt so suffocating. 60 of our closest friends and family members watched as Elena held the microphone, her voice carrying across the elegant space, decorated with white roses and golden accents. I thought she was about to give a toast to our future. Instead, she delivered a eulogy to our relationship. I can't do this anymore, she announced, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I've tried to be patient, tried to believe that things would change, but I can't marry someone who refuses to grow up financially. The room fell silent except for the soft jazz playing in the background, now jarringly inappropriate. My mother's sharp intake of breath echoed from the front table. Elena's sister covered her mouth in shock. I stood frozen, champagne glass halfway to my lips, unable to process what was happening. Marcus is a good man, Elena continued, as if that somehow softened the blow. But I need someone who can provide stability, who has ambition beyond just getting by. She turned to me then, her eyes glistening but determined. I'm sorry, but I can't pretend anymore that love is enough when you're content with mediocrity. She placed the engagement ring, the modest 2-carat diamond I'd chosen deliberately, on the gift table beside the unopened bottles of champagne, and walked toward the exit. The click of her heels against the marble floor seemed to echo forever. My best friend David started to stand, probably to chase after her, or comfort me, but I held up a hand. The room buzzed with whispers and uncomfortable shifting. Someone's phone camera flash went off, capturing what would undoubtedly become the most humiliating moment of my life. Thank you all for coming, I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. Please, enjoy the dinner. The deposits are non-refundable anyway. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, but most people just stared at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. I set down my champagne glass and walked out through the kitchen exit, avoiding the main lobby where Elena had probably called her Uber that night. I sat in my modest downtown apartment, the same one-bedroom place I'd lived in for 5 years, and stared at the ring she'd left behind. It sat on my coffee table like an accusation, catching the light from my laptop screen where I'd been reviewing quarterly reports for Chen Logistics Solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Elena had been planning our wedding, I had been planning the largest acquisition in my company's history. While she'd been worrying about our financial future, I'd been quietly building an empire that would soon make me one of the wealthiest men in America, but she'd never know that now. She'd made her choice based on appearances, on the careful illusion I'd maintained. The test I'd designed had worked perfectly and destroyed everything I'd hoped to build with her. I picked up the ring and held it up to the light, watching the diamond sparkle. Such a small thing to represent such a massive failure of trust on both our parts. The first stock certificate of Chen Logistics Solutions still hung in my office, framed behind my desk where only I could see it. 100 shares, issued to myself 12 years ago when the company existed only in my imagination and a cramped garage in Oakland. Back then, those shares were worth exactly nothing. Today, they represented the foundation of a empire. I'd started with a simple observation. Businesses were hemorrhaging money on inefficient supply chains, but they didn't know it. My background in computer science and logistics, combined with an obsessive attention to detail, led me to develop algorithms that could optimize delivery routes, predict inventory needs, and reduce waste by up to 40%. The early years were brutal. I lived on ramen noodles and coffee, sleeping on a futon in the office, taking meetings in borrowed conference rooms. My parents, immigrants from Taiwan, who'd sacrificed everything for my education, watched nervously as I turned down stable job offers to chase what they saw as an impossible dream. Marcus, my father had said, in his careful English, smart man takes sure thing. Why you want to be poor when you can be comfortable? But I'd seen something they couldn't: the massive inefficiency and how goods moved around the world. Every delayed shipment, every warehouse sitting half empty while another overflowed. Every truck driving empty routes represented money bleeding away. My algorithms could fix that. The first major client was a regional grocery chain that agreed to let me optimize their distribution network. Within 6 months, I'd saved them $3 million in logistics costs. Word spread quickly in the industry. Soon, major retailers, manufacturing companies, and even government agencies were calling. I reinvested every penny back into the company, hiring brilliant engineers and mathematicians who shared my vision. We developed artificial intelligence systems that could predict demand patterns months in advance, automated inventory management that eliminated human error, and route optimization that made overnight shipping profitable even for small packages. By year 5, we were handling logistics for some of the biggest names in retail. By year 8, we'd expanded internationally. By year 10, we were the invisible backbone of global commerce, processing millions of transactions daily while most people had never heard our name. The beauty of the logistics business was its invisibility. Unlike flashy tech companies with celebrity CEOs, we operated in the shadows. Our clients valued discretion and efficiency over publicity. This suited me perfectly. I could build wealth without the scrutiny that came with fame. When I met Elena 3 years ago at David's wedding, I'd already achieved what most entrepreneurs only dream of. But I was also lonely, tired of relationships that ended the moment women learned about my net worth. I'd dated enough gold diggers to recognize the signs: the sudden interest in expensive restaurants, the hints about luxury vacations, the way conversations always circled back to money. Elena had been different, or so I'd thought. She worked as a marketing coordinator at a nonprofit, drove a 5-year-old Honda, and seemed genuinely uncomfortable when I offered to pay for expensive dates. When she insisted on splitting dinner bills, I'd felt a spark of hope that maybe, finally, I'd found someone who could love me for who I was rather than what I owned. So, I'd made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. I would hide my wealth completely. I moved into a modest apartment, drove a used Toyota, and created an entirely fictional version of my life. I told Elena I was a logistics consultant who worked with small businesses, which was technically true but deliberately misleading. The test wasn't meant to be cruel. I genuinely wanted to know if she could love Marcus, the man someone she believed was struggling financially but had good character and potential. I planned to reveal everything after we were married, to share my success as a gift to the woman who'd chosen me despite thinking I had nothing to offer. Looking back now, I realize how naive that plan was. Love built on deception, even well-intentioned deception, was doomed from the start. The letter I never sent still sits in my desk drawer, handwritten on my personal stationery late one night about 6 months into our relationship. I'd been struggling with the weight of my deception, wanting to explain to Elena why I felt the need to test her love in such an elaborate way. "My dearest Elena," it began, "I need you to understand something about wealth and love that I've learned the hard way." I'd written about Sarah, the woman I dated 4 years earlier who'd seemed perfect until she discovered my net worth. Within days of learning about my success, she'd transformed from an independent, thoughtful person into someone who expected first-class flights, designer handbags, and expensive jewelry. When I'd tried to discuss my discomfort with her changed behavior, she'd laughed and said, "Marcus, you're rich. This is what rich people do." I'd written about Jennifer, who'd actually researched my company online and started dating me specifically because of my wealth. She'd been honest about her intentions, at least, but the transactional nature of our relationship had left me feeling hollow in the letter. I'd tried to explain the loneliness of success, how it felt to wonder if anyone would love me if I lost everything tomorrow. I'd described the anxiety of every new relationship, the constant questioning of motives, the way money seemed to corrupt even the most genuine connections. "I don't want to be loved for my achievements," I'd written. "I want to be loved for my character, my humor, my capacity for loyalty and growth. I want someone who would stand by me if I lost everything, who sees value in who I am rather than what I own." But I'd never sent the letter. Every time I'd considered revealing the truth, something would happen that reinforced my decision to wait. Elena would make a comment about money, or I'd overhear a conversation that made me doubt her motivations, or I'd simply lose my nerve. The truth was, I'd fallen in love with Elena's apparent indifference to wealth. She seemed happy with simple pleasures: walks in the park, home-cooked meals, movies on my couch. When I'd suggested expensive restaurants, she'd counter with food trucks. When I'd hinted at weekend trips to luxury resorts, she'd propose camping. "I don't need fancy things to be happy," she'd said one evening, as we shared takeout Chinese food on my apartment floor. "I just need someone who makes me laugh and treats me with respect." Those words had convinced me that I'd found something rare and precious. Here was a woman who valued simplicity, who seemed immune to the materialism that had poisoned my previous relationships. I'd felt vindicated in my approach, confident that Elena truly loved me for who I was. But there were moments that gave me pause. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at expensive cars or jewelry, with a longing she quickly hid. She'd make subtle comments about friends who were doing well, or mention how nice it would be to have financial security. These moments were brief, but they planted seeds of doubt. I'd justified my continued deception by telling myself I was protecting both of us. If Elena truly loved me, she'd understand once I revealed the truth. If she didn't, then I'd have saved us both years of a relationship built on false foundations. The irony was that in trying to create a test of authentic love, I'd made authentic love impossible. How could we build something real when our entire relationship was based on a fundamental lie about who I was? As I'd written in that unsent letter, I hope someday you'll forgive me for needing proof of something that should have been taken on faith. ***. The credit card statements arrived 3 months before our engagement party, and they told a story Elena had been careful to hide. While she'd been splitting dinner bills with me and insisting on budget-friendly dates, she'd been racking up over $40,000 in debt on luxury purchases. I discovered this by accident when she'd asked me to grab her mail while she was traveling for work. A late payment notice had fallen out of the stack, and something about the amount $847 minimum payment had caught my attention. When she returned, I'd gently asked about it, pretending I'd seen it by mistake. "Oh, that's just an old card I need to pay off," she'd said, dismissing it with a wave. From before I got serious about budgeting, but the dates on the statement told a different story. The charges were recent designer clothes, expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together, spa treatments, and jewelry, all purchased. While she was dating me, while she was supposedly embracing a simpler lifestyle, I'd hired a discreet financial investigator, telling myself I needed to understand what I was getting into before marriage. The report had been devastating. Elena had not one but 4 credit cards, all maxed out. She owed money to friends, had borrowed against her 401k, and was 3 months behind on her car payment, despite telling me it was paid off. More troubling were the patterns the investigator uncovered. Elena had a history of dating men she perceived as wealthy, relationships that ended when she discovered their true financial situations. She'd been engaged twice before, once to a man she'd believed was a successful lawyer until she learned he was drowning in student debt, and once to someone who'd claimed to be a real estate mogul, but was actually a part-time agent living with his parents. The investigator had even found her profile on a dating app specifically designed for wealthy individuals, where she'd listed her occupation as marketing executive and her interests as fine dining, travel, and luxury experiences. The photos she'd used were professional headshots that made her look more polished and affluent than the Elena I knew. What broke my heart most was a recorded conversation the investigator had captured between Elena and her sister at a coffee shop. They'd been discussing our relationship, and Elena's words had shattered whatever hope I'd had left. "He's sweet, and he treats me well," Elena had said, "but I can't live like this forever. I need someone who can take care of me, who has real ambition. Marcus is comfortable being mediocre, and I'm not." Her sister had asked if she loved me, and Elena's pause had been telling. "I love how he makes me feel about myself," she'd finally said, "but love doesn't pay bills or give you security. I'm 32, Anna. I can't keep dating guys who can't provide for a family." The conversation had continued with Elena detailing her financial troubles, her mounting debt, and her family's pressure to find a suitable partner. She'd spoken about me with genuine affection, but it was clear that affection was secondary to her financial anxiety. "I keep hoping he'll surprise me," she'd said. "Maybe he's just being modest about his success, or maybe he has family money. He hasn't mentioned, but every month that passes, I realize this is really who he is, someone who's content with just getting by." That recording had been the final confirmation I'd needed. Elena's love was conditional on my ability to provide the lifestyle she wanted. The woman who'd insisted on splitting dinner bills had been performing a role, just as I'd been performing mine. The tragic irony was that we'd both been lying to each other about money, but for opposite reasons. I'd hidden my wealth to test her love. She'd hidden her debts to maintain my interest. We'd created a relationship built on mutual deception, each of us trying to manipulate the other into loving a version of ourselves that didn't exist. When I'd listened to that recording, I'd felt a strange mix of vindication and heartbreak. I'd been right to test her, she'd failed spectacularly. But I'd also lost something I desperately wanted to be real. The wedding venue contracts sat on my kitchen counter like evidence of a crime, every page a reminder of dreams that had curdled into lies. $12,000 for the Fairmont Hotel ballroom, non-refundable deposit paid in full. Elena had insisted on the venue despite my protests about the cost, and I'd agreed while secretly knowing I could afford 100 such receptions. The final argument had started over flowers. Of all things, Elena had wanted white orchids flown in from Thailand, a $3,000 upgrade from the already expensive local arrangements. When I'd gently suggested we might want to consider something more budget-friendly, she'd exploded. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Marcus," she'd shouted, throwing the florist's catalog across my living room. "You have no vision, no desire to make anything special or beautiful. Do you want our wedding to look like a backyard barbecue?" I'd tried to explain that beautiful didn't have to mean expensive, that we could create something meaningful within our supposed budget, but Elena had been past listening. "Your budget," she'd said with venom. "It's always your budget, your limitations, your small thinking. When are you going to stop making excuses and start building a real life?" That's when she'd delivered the ultimatum that would seal our fate. "I need to know you're serious about our future," she'd said, her voice cold and calculated. "I need to see that you're willing to invest in us, to take risks, to be ambitious. If you can't even spend money on our wedding, how can I trust you to provide for our children?" She'd given me a week to figure out my priorities, as she'd put it. A week to prove I was worthy of her love by demonstrating my willingness to spend money I supposedly didn't have. I'd spent that week in a strange state of clarity. Every conversation we'd had about money suddenly made sense. Every subtle criticism about my apartment, my car, my clothes, they'd all been tests that I'd been failing by design. Elena hadn't been falling in love with Marcus, the modest logistics consultant. She'd been waiting for Marcus the consultant to transform into Marcus the provider. The engagement party had been her final test. She'd planned it as a public forum where I could demonstrate my financial commitment to our relationship. The expensive venue, the premium bar package, the elaborate catering, all of it, had been Elena's way of forcing me to reveal my true financial capabilities. When I'd stuck to my character and chosen modest options within my fictional budget, I'd failed her test just as she'd failed mine. The morning of the party, I'd found her in my bathroom, applying makeup with unusual care. She'd been nervous, checking her appearance obsessively in the mirror. "Are you ready for tonight?" she'd asked, and there'd been something in her tone that suggested she wasn't talking about the party itself. "Ready as I'll ever be," I'd replied, not understanding that she'd been giving me one last chance to confess my deception. Now, staring at the venue contract, I understood what had really happened. Elena had walked into that ballroom expecting either a revelation about my hidden wealth or the ammunition she needed to justify leaving me. When I'd continued my charade of financial modesty, she'd chosen public humiliation as her exit strategy. Cruelest part was that her speech had been prepared. The words had come too smoothly, the timing too perfect. She'd planned to leave me all along. The only question had been whether she'd do it quietly or dramatically. I'd given her drama, and she'd taken it. The Forbes magazine arrived at my office on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 weeks and 2 days after Elena had walked out of my life. My assistant, Jennifer, had been the first to see it, her excited squeals echoing through the executive floor of our downtown headquarters. "Mr. Chen," she'd called, bursting through my office door with the magazine clutched to her chest. "You made the list. Number 847 on the Forbes Billionaire list." I'd been reviewing acquisition proposals for a European logistics firm, my mind focused on expansion strategies and market penetration. The magazine felt surreal and my hands glossy pages filled with photos of people I'd only seen in business news. And there, on page 47, was my own headshot alongside a brief description of Chen Logistics Solutions. Marcus Chen, 47, built his fortune on the invisible backbone of global commerce. His AI-powered logistics algorithms now handle supply chain optimization for Fortune 500 companies worldwide, generating annual revenues exceeding $3.2 billion. Estimated net worth, $2.1 billion. The article was factual but impersonal, reducing 12 years of relentless work to a few sentences. It mentioned my reclusive nature and preference for operating behind the scenes, noting that I'd rarely given interviews and maintained a deliberately low public profile. That reading about myself in third person felt like looking at a stranger. The numbers were accurate. Forbes had done their research meticulously, but they couldn't capture the sleepless nights, the risks, the constant pressure of building something from nothing. They couldn't convey the loneliness that came with success. Wealth had complicated every relationship I'd tried to build. My phone started ringing within an hour of the magazine's publication. Business reporters, investment analysts, and acquisition specialists all wanted interviews with the mysterious logistics mogul who'd somehow flown under the radar for over a decade. My marketing director fielded dozens of calls, politely declining most requests while scheduling a few strategic conversations with key industry publications. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd hidden this success from the woman I'd wanted to marry. Now it was public knowledge, available to anyone with $5 and access to a newsstand. Elena could walk into any bookstore and learn more about my net worth than I'd ever told her in 3 years of dating. Jennifer had been practically vibrating with excitement as she'd shown me the early online reactions. Social media was already buzzing with speculation about my personal life, my spending habits, and my future plans. Someone had found old photos of my modest apartment and was posting them alongside my Forbes profile, creating memes about billionaire, minimalism. "Should I prepare a statement about your privacy preferences?" Jennifer had asked, ever the professional, despite her obvious excitement. "Let's wait and see how this develops," I'd replied, though I'd already suspected where the first personal call would come from. The call had come at 3:47 p.m. Pacific time. Elena's name on my phone screen had sent a jolt through my system that surprised me with its intensity. After 3 weeks of silence, seeing her number felt like receiving a message from another lifetime. I'd let it go to voicemail, then immediately regretted it. Part of me, the part that had loved her despite everything, wanted to hear her voice, to understand what she was thinking now that the truth was public. But I'd also known that answering would be a mistake. Whatever Elena had to say now would be colored by Forbes magazine and the number $2.1 billion. Any conversation we had would be tainted by the knowledge of what she'd walked away from, making it impossible to determine whether her words were genuine or motivated by regret. ***, the Text messages started within hours of the Forbes publication, each one more desperate than the last. I'd saved screenshots of every message, creating an unintentional timeline of Elena's emotional breakdown. Marcus, I just saw the news. We need to talk. For 23 p.m., please call me back. I know you're upset, but this changes things. 4:31 p.m. I made a terrible mistake. Can we please just talk? 5:45 p.m. BY evening. The tone had shifted from apologetic to entitled. You lied to me for 3 years. How is that any different from what I did? Oito e doze policial militar. I can't believe you let me humiliate myself like that when you could have stopped it. Oito e 27 policial militar. You wanted me to fail your little test, didn't you? You enjoyed watching me leave. 9:03 p.m. the next morning brought a new strategy, reaching out through mutual friends. David had called first, his voice uncomfortable as he'd delivered Elena's message. She says she knows she handled things badly, but she thinks you two need to have an honest conversation about what really happened. He'd told me. She's pretty broken up about this. Marcus, maybe you could at least hear her out. Then my mother had called, having somehow received a visit from Elena at her house in Sacramento. Such a lovely girl, my mother had said in Mandarin, her voice reproachful. She came all the way here to apologize, to explain her mistake. Why are you being so stubborn, Marcus? Rich or poor, you need a good woman. Elena's sister Anna had sent me a long email detailing Elena's emotional state, painting her as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of our relationship's demise. According to Anna, Elena had been struggling with financial anxiety and pressure from family expectations, making her behavior understandable, if not forgivable. The most disturbing development had been Elena's social media campaign. Posted a series of Instagram stories that painted their relationship in an entirely new light. Photos of us together were accompanied by captions like, "When you think you know someone," and 3 years of believing in love over money. She'd shared screenshots of articles about my Forbes listing, adding commentary that suggested she'd been blindsided by my deception. Imagine discovering the person you loved was testing you the entire time. She'd written, imagine realizing that every conversation about money was a lie. The posts had garnered sympathy from her followers, many of whom didn't know the full story. Comments poured in, supporting Elena and criticizing me for my emotional manipulation and trust issues. Someone had even started a hashtag, #HonestLove, By the end of the week, Elena's messages had taken on a manic quality. I've been thinking about us for days. We both made mistakes, but we loved each other. That has to count for something. Monday, 6:15 a.m. I don't care about the money. Marcus? I never did. I was just scared of being poor again. Monday, 10:33 a.m. My therapist says we both have trust issues we need to work through. We could do that together. Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. I drove by your old apartment today. Remember when we were happy? Before all this money nonsense complicated everything? Wednesday, 7:21 p.m. The Thursday message had been the breaking point. I know you're reading these. Your silence is cruel. Marcus, after 3 years together, don't I deserve at least a conversation? You owe me that much. The word "owe" had crystallized. Something for me. Elena still believed she was entitled to my time, my explanations, my forgiveness. Even now, she was approaching our relationship as a transaction where she deserved compensation for her emotional investment. Her final message had arrived Friday morning. Fine, if you won't talk to me, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I have emails. Marcus, I have recordings. I have proof of how you manipulated me. That threat had forced my hand. Elena was spiraling, and her desperation was making her dangerous. If she really did have evidence of our private conversations, she could spin our story in whatever direction served her narrative. I needed to control this situation before it destroyed both of us. I'd finally typed back a single message. Coffee, tomorrow, noon. Our old place on Pine Street. Come alone. *** Blue Bottle Coffee on Pine Street had been our place during the early days of our relationship. We'd spent countless Saturday mornings there, sharing pastries and reading different sections of the newspaper, comfortable in the kind of easy silence that had made me believe we might have a future together. Now the familiar space felt like a courtroom. Elena arrived 10 minutes late, her appearance carefully curated to evoke sympathy. She'd chosen the vintage dress I'd once complimented, styled her hair the way she knew I liked it, and even worn the small pearl earrings I'd given her for her birthday. Every detail was calculated to remind me of what we'd once had. I'd deliberately arrived early and chosen a corner table where we could talk privately. The coffee shop receipt in my pocket would later serve as a reminder of this moment. $4.75 for a simple black coffee that had tasted like regret. Marcus, she said as she sat down, her voice carefully modulated to suggest both vulnerability and strength. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I studied her face, looking for traces of the woman I'd thought I'd known. She was still beautiful, still capable of making my heart skip when she smiled. But there was something different in her eyes, a calculation that had always been there but which I'd learned to recognize. You threatened me, I said simply. That seemed like something we should discuss in person. I didn't threaten you, Elena replied, her tone becoming defensive. I just said I had documentation of our relationship. That's not a threat, that's a fact. She'd ordered a complicated drink hand oat milk cortado with an extra shot in vanilla syrup, and I'd found myself wondering if this too was part of her performance. The Elena I'd known had always ordered simple coffee. Let's be honest with each other for once, I said, leaning back in my chair. You came here because you realized you walked away from $2 billion, and you want to see if there's any way to fix that mistake. Her composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of anger crossing her features before she regained control. That's not fair, she said. Yes, I'm shocked about your wealth. Yes, I wish things had happened differently. But I came here because I realized we both made terrible mistakes, and maybe we could learn from them. Elena launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about miscommunication, financial anxiety, and the pressure of modern relationships. She spoke about her family's expectations, her fears about security, and her genuine confusion about my behavior. You have to understand, she said, her voice gaining passion. I was dating someone who seemed content with mediocrity. You never talked about ambitions or goals. You never seemed to want more than just getting by. How was I supposed to know you were testing me? I never asked you to be content with mediocrity, I replied. I asked you to be content with me. But you weren't you. Elena's voice rose, drawing glances from other customers. She lowered it immediately, but her frustration was clear. You were playing a character, Marcus. You created this whole false persona and then judged me for not loving someone who didn't exist. She wasn't wrong, and that made her words sting more than they should have. You're right, I admitted. I was playing a character, but so were you. The woman who insisted on splitting dinner bills, who claimed she didn't care about money, who said she just wanted someone who treated her with respect, that was as much a performance as my modest lifestyle. Elena's eyes flashed with something. Between anger and embarrassment, I was trying to be what you wanted, she said quietly. I thought you valued simplicity, so I tried to be simple. I thought you wanted someone who wasn't materialistic, so I hid my real feelings about financial security. And when you realized I wasn't going to transform into the provider you actually wanted, you decided to humiliate me publicly rather than have an honest conversation. Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. I was angry, she finally said. I felt like you'd been lying to me, and I wanted you to feel as foolish as I did. Mission accomplished. Asterisk. I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a manila folder on the table between us. Elena's eyes followed the movement, her expression shifting from hope to confusion to dawning horror as she recognized what it might contain. Before we go any further with this conversation, I said, opening the folder, I think you should know exactly how much I knew about your situation. The private investigator's report was thorough and damning. Bank statements, credit card records, loan applications, and a detailed timeline of Elena's financial desperation going back 18 months. I watched her face as she flipped through the pages, seeing her own deception laid out in black and white. You investigated me. Her voice was barely a whisper. I hired someone to do a standard background check before proposing, I said. What they found was considerably more extensive than I'd expected. Elena's hands trembled as she reached the page detailing her dating history. The investigator had been thorough interviews with ex-boyfriends, analysis of her online dating, profiles, even records of the luxury purchases she'd made while claiming to embrace financial simplicity. I know about the $43,000 in credit card debt, I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I felt. I know about the second mortgage your parents took on their house to help with your student loans. I know about the dating app specifically for wealthy men, and I know about the conversation you had with your sister about needing to find someone who could take care of you. Elena looked up from the papers, tears streaming down her face, but I wasn't finished. I know you researched my company 3 months into our relationship, trying to figure out if I was hiding wealth. I know you drove by the Chen Logistics building downtown and asked the security guard about the owner. I know you even called our main number pretending to be a potential client, trying to learn more about the company's finances. The last revelation hit her like a physical blow. She'd thought her investigation had been subtle, but professional investigators leave digital footprints that are easy to follow if you know where to look. Marcus, I am not done, I said, turning to another section of the report. I know about your previous engagements, Elena, both of them. I know you left Robert when you discovered he wasn't actually a successful lawyer, but a public defender drowning in student debt. I know you called off your engagement to David when his real estate business turned out to be a part-time hobby, rather than a profitable career. Elena's face had gone pale, her earlier composure completely shattered. You have a pattern, I continued, feeling both vindicated and sick. You target men you believe are successful, build relationships based on that assumption, then leave when you discover their true financial situation. The only difference with me was that I actually did have the wealth you were looking for, just chose not to reveal it. She closed the folder with shaking hands, unable to look at the evidence of her own calculated behavior. How long have you known? She asked quietly. About 6 months, I admitted. I kept hoping I was wrong, that there was another explanation for the inconsistencies in your stories. I wanted to believe that your feelings for me were genuine despite the evidence. They were genuine, Elena said, her voice desperate. Marcus, you have to understand, yes, I was looking for financial security, but I also fell in love with you. Both things can be true, can they? I asked. Because listening to you tell your sister that you couldn't marry someone content with mediocrity? It sounded like love was a distant second to financial considerations. Elena winced, realizing I'd heard the recording. I was scared, she said. I've been poor, Marcus. I've watched my parents struggle, seen what financial stress does to relationships. I didn't want that life. So you decided to find someone else to pay for the life you wanted, instead of building it yourself. Asterisk, the pawn shop receipt fell out of Elena's purse as she fumbled for tissues, landing face up on our table like an accusation. $1,200 for a Cartier watch, the same watch I'd seen her wearing just 2 weeks ago at David's birthday dinner. The date on the receipt was from yesterday. Elena saw me notice it, and her face crumpled completely. The last of her carefully constructed facade dissolved, leaving behind someone I'd never seen before, raw, desperate, and utterly defeated. I pawned it to pay rent, she whispered, gathering the receipt with trembling fingers. My landlord was going to evict me next week. For the first time since she'd sat down, Elena looked genuinely vulnerable rather than strategically emotional. Her shoulders sagged as if the weight of maintaining her deceptions had finally become too much to bear. Tell me about your family, I said quietly, setting aside the investigator's report. Tell me the truth this time. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. When she spoke, her voice was different, smaller, more honest than I'd heard it in months. My father lost his job when I was in college, she began. He was a middle manager at a manufacturing company that got bought out by a Chinese firm. They kept some workers, but eliminated all the management positions, said they could run things more efficiently with their own people. She stared out the coffee shop window, watching pedestrians hurry past in their afternoon lives. We lost the house 6 months later. Dad couldn't find anything that paid even half what he'd been making. Mom took a job at Walmart, and Dad started driving for Uber, but it wasn't enough. We had to move into a 2-bedroom apartment, and I had to take out additional loans to finish school. I found myself leaning forward despite my anger, drawn into a story that felt more authentic than anything she'd shared during our relationship. Dad started drinking, Elena continued. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but just steadily. A beer with lunch became 2 beers, then 3. Mom would find empty bottles in his car, in the garage, hidden in the laundry room. He was ashamed, I think, about not being able to provide for us. She turned back to face me, her eyes red but clear. When I graduated and got my first job, I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable again. I would never depend on someone else's success for my security, and I would never watch someone I loved destroy themselves because they couldn't pay bills. Elena pulled out her phone and showed me a photo I'd never seen her parents at. What it looked like a company Christmas party, both dressed nicely, her father's arm around her mother as they smiled at the camera. This was taken 2 months before he lost his job, she said. Look how happy they look. Look how confident. Dad was talking about early retirement, about taking Mom on a cruise for their anniversary. 3 years later, they were shopping at food banks and arguing about whether we could afford cable TV. I studied the photo, seeing echoes of Elena in both her parents' faces, understanding for the first time where her financial anxiety had originated. So when I started dating, she continued, I looked for stability first. I told myself that was just being practical, being smart. Love was important, but love didn't pay for healthcare or car repairs or retirement. Elena's voice grew quieter as she continued. My sister Anna married her college boyfriend, a really sweet guy who worked at a nonprofit. They love each other deeply, but they've been struggling financially for 8 years. They can't afford to have kids, can't buy a house, can't even take vacations. Anna calls Mom crying sometimes because they had to choose between fixing their car and paying for Anna's medication. She looked down at her hands, twisting the tissue she'd been holding. I didn't want that life. Marcus, I know that makes me sound materialistic and shallow, but I've seen what financial stress does to people. I've seen it destroy love, destroy families, destroy hope. So yes, I looked for men who could provide security. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of it either. For the first time since I'd known her, Elena sounded completely honest. The performance was gone, replaced by someone who was tired of pretending to be something she wasn't. When I met you, she said, you seemed different. You were kind and funny and intelligent, but you also seemed content with so little. It confused me. I kept waiting for you to show ambition, to talk about goals or dreams or plans for the future. When you didn't, I started to panic. She laughed bitterly. The irony is that you had more ambition and success than anyone I'd ever dated. You just hid it so well that I convinced myself you were another. Anna's husband, a good man, who would never be able to provide the security I needed. Asterisk. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a different folder. This one containing the original incorporation documents for Chen Logistics Solutions. The papers were worn from handling, creased from the years I'd spent carrying them as a reminder of how far I'd come. "I want to show you something," I said, opening to the first page. "This is the foundation document for my company, signed 12 years ago in a garage in Oakland." Elena looked at the papers, her brow furrowed as she tried to understand their significance. "My parents came to America with nothing," I began, echoing her honesty with my own. "My father worked 3 jobs: dishwasher at a restaurant during the day, security guard at night, and weekend custodial work at an office building. My mother cleaned houses and took in sewing to make extra money." I pointed to a line on the incorporation papers where my father had signed as a witness, his careful handwriting, a testament to the English classes he'd taken at night school. "They sacrificed everything for my education. Dad would come home from his security shift at 6 a.m., sleep for 3 hours, then drive me to math tutoring before going to his restaurant job. Mom would pack my lunch every day with food that was nicer than anything she ate herself." Elena studied the document, beginning to understand why I was showing it to her. "When I told them I was turning down job offers to start my own company, they were terrified. They'd worked so hard to give me security, and I was throwing it away to chase what they saw as an impossible dream." I turned to another page, showing the modest initial investment that had funded my first algorithms. "I lived on $15,000 that first year." $15,000, Elena. "I slept in the office because I couldn't afford rent. I ate rice and beans for months because meat was too expensive. I wore the same 3 shirts in rotation because I couldn't afford a professional wardrobe." The memories were still vivid: the hunger, the uncertainty, the nights when I'd wondered if my parents had been right to fear my choice, but I'd seen something they couldn't see. I'd grown up watching my parents work themselves to exhaustion for bosses who didn't value them, who could eliminate their jobs with a signature on a downsizing memo. I promised myself I would never be that vulnerable to someone else's decisions. Elena's expression had shifted as she listened, her earlier defensiveness replaced by something that looked like recognition. "The difference between us," I continued, "is that I decided to build my own security rather than find someone else to provide it. When you were looking for men who could take care of you, I was working 20-hour days to ensure I'd never need anyone to take care of me." I pulled out my phone and showed her a photo from 5 years ago, me standing in front of a small warehouse that had been our second office location. This was taken the day we signed our first major contract. I called my parents immediately to tell them the news, and my father cried on the phone, not because of the money, but because he finally understood that the risk had been worth it. Elena stared at the photo, seeing the exhaustion and triumph in my younger face. "Every relationship I've had since building this company has been complicated by money," I said. "Women who were interested in Marcus Chen, CEO, but couldn't see Marcus Chen, person. Women who loved the lifestyle I could provide but grew bored with the man who provided it." I closed the folder and looked directly at Elena. "I tested you because I desperately wanted someone who could love me without knowing about the company, the wealth, the public recognition. I wanted someone who chose me for my character, my values, my potential as a partner and father." Elena, eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different from her earlier emotional displays. "I understand why you wanted security," I continued. "I've been poor too, Elena. I know the fear, the anxiety, the way financial stress can poison everything good in your life. But I also know that depending on someone else for that security is its own kind of vulnerability." I gestured toward the folder containing the investigator's report. "You spent 3 years researching my financial situation, trying to determine if I could provide the life you wanted. In that same 3 years, you could have built your own security, started your own business, invested in your own future." Elena wiped her eyes, her voice barely audible when she spoke. "I never thought of it that way, because you were taught that security comes from finding the right person, rather than becoming the right person. Your parents' story shaped you just like mine shaped me, but we learned opposite lessons." I reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. "I'm not saying my way was better, Elena. I'm saying we both let fear drive our choices, and we both paid the price." Asterisk, asterisk, the newspaper headlines started appearing 3 days after our coffee shop confrontation. Someone, probably another customer, who'd overheard our conversation had recognized me from the Forbes article and shared the story on social media. By Thursday morning, our private drama had become public entertainment. "Billionaire's secret test of love backfires," screamed the New York Post. "Tech mogul hides wealth from fiancé, leaves her anyway," declared the Daily Mail. "The $2 billion breakup, when honesty and money collide," analyzed the Wall Street Journal. I sat in my office at 6 a.m., scrolling through articles that dissected my relationship with the casual cruelty of tabloid journalism. The story had taken on a life of its own, with opinions divided sharply along gender and generational lines. Some painted Elena as a gold digger who'd gotten her comeuppance, while others portrayed me as a manipulative billionaire who'd emotionally abused a woman seeking reasonable financial security. Comment sections had become battlegrounds where strangers debated the ethics of our choices with passionate certainty. My publicist, Sarah Martinez, had been fielding calls since dawn. "CNN wants a statement," she said, entering my office with a stack of interview requests. So do Good Morning America, The View, and about 40 other outlets. Business Insider is running a piece on whether wealth disclosure is necessary in modern relationships. The most painful coverage came from feminist blogs that painted Elena as a victim of my psychological manipulation. One particularly viral piece, titled "The Billionaire Who Gaslit His Girlfriend," had been shared over 100,000 times and spawned countless response articles. Mr. Chen created an elaborate fiction to test his girlfriend's character, the article read, but what he really tested was her tolerance for being deceived. The fact that she prioritized financial security doesn't make her shallow. It makes her realistic in a world where women still earn less and have fewer opportunities for building wealth. Elena's Instagram had exploded with supportive messages from women sharing their own stories of financial anxiety and relationship struggles. She'd become an inadvertent spokesperson for women who'd been criticized for wanting financial stability, turning our private dysfunction into a public conversation about money, gender, and power in relationships. But the support came with a cost. Elena's address had been discovered by internet investigators, forcing her to stay with her sister to avoid photographers and curious strangers. Her workplace had been inundated with calls from reporters, and her boss had asked her to take temporary leave while the attention died down. The coverage of me was equally invasive. Business reporters had dug into every aspect of Chen Logistics Solutions, analyzing our client relationships and speculating about how the negative publicity might affect our contracts. Photos of my apartment, my car, and my parents' house had appeared online alongside breathless analyses of my deceptive lifestyle choices. The most surreal moment had come when my mother called, confused by a reporter who'd shown up at her door asking about my childhood trauma and whether she'd taught me to be secretive about money. I told them, "You were always a good boy who worked hard," she'd said in Mandarin, her voice bewildered. "Why are strangers asking about our family business?" My father, more pragmatic, had simply asked, "This woman, was she worth all this trouble?" By Friday, the story had reached international outlets. British tabloids were running headlines about American dating culture gone wrong, while German business publications analyzed my case as an example of wealth inequality affecting personal relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to avoid the complications of public wealth, I'd created the biggest public spectacle of my life. Our private relationship had become a case study, our personal failures transformed into entertainment. For millions of people who would never know the real Elena or the real Marcus, Elena had tried calling twice, but I'd let both calls go to voicemail. Her messages were brief and exhausted. "This is insane, Marcus. We need to figure out how to make it stop." But I wasn't sure it could be stopped. We'd become characters in a story that no longer belonged to us, symbols in a cultural debate that had moved far beyond our actual relationship. The woman I'd loved and the man I'd tried to be had both been lost somewhere in the headlines. ***. The wedding photos arrived on a Saturday morning. 2 weeks after the media storm had begun to die down. Elena had had them delivered to my office, perhaps knowing I wouldn't be there to refuse them. The package sat on my desk when I arrived on Monday, her handwriting on the label achingly familiar. Inside were the engagement photos we'd taken 6 months earlier at Golden Gate Park, back when our future had seemed certain. Looking at them now felt like examining archaeological evidence of a lost civilization, proof that Marcus and Elena had once existed as something real and hopeful. In the photos, we looked genuinely happy. Elena's smile was unguarded, her laughter caught mid-burst as I'd whispered something silly in her ear. My own expression showed a contentment I'd forgotten, I'd felt. The satisfaction of a man who believed he'd found his person. The photographer had captured moments I'd forgotten, Elena adjusting my tie with gentle concentration, me spinning her in circles until she shrieked with delight, both of us collapsed on a park bench, sharing a bag of overpriced artisanal popcorn. In every frame, we looked like people in love rather than people performing love. Had those moments been real, or had we both been acting even then? The question haunted me as I studied each image, searching for signs of the deception that had poisoned everything. Elena's note was brief. "I found these when I was packing my apartment. I thought you might want them. Or maybe we both need to. Remember that some of it was real. She was moving, then probably leaving San Francisco entirely to escape the lingering attention from our public spectacle. I couldn't blame her. The city had become a minefield of memories and unwanted recognition for both of us. I'd been doing my own form of packing, though mine was emotional rather than physical. The past month had forced me to examine not just our relationship but all the choices that had led me to that coffee shop confrontation. The more I reflected, the more I realized how isolated I'd become in my pursuit of success. Chen Logistics Solutions had given me financial freedom, but social imprisonment. I'd built walls around my personal life that had kept out gold diggers but also genuine connections. The few friends I'd maintained were either business associates who knew me as CEO first, or old college friends who felt increasingly distant from the person I'd become. Elena had been my first attempt at authentic intimacy in years. but I'd sabotaged it from the start with my elaborate test. I'd created the very conditions that made genuine love impossible, then blamed her when she failed to achieve it. The tragic irony was that we'd both been seeking the same thing: love that could survive external pressures. Elena had wanted someone who could weather financial storms. I'd wanted someone who could weather wealth. Neither of us had realized that the real test wasn't whether love could survive money problems or money abundance, but whether it could survive the dishonesty we'd both brought to the relationship. My therapist, Dr. Kim, had been helping me understand the patterns that had led to this disaster. "You've been using your wealth as both a shield and a weapon," she'd observed during one particularly difficult session. "It protects you from certain kinds of pain, but prevents you from experiencing certain kinds of joy." The photos Elena had sent proved her point. In those images, taken when I believed Elena loved the modest logistics consultant I was pretending to be, I looked more genuinely happy than in any photos from business events or Forbes interviews. "What if," Dr. Kim had asked, "instead of testing whether someone could love you despite your wealth, you worked on becoming someone worth loving regardless of your wealth?" It was a question that had been echoing in my mind for weeks. What kind of person was I without the money, without the company, without the achievements that had defined my adult life? Could I even separate Marcus the man from Marcus the billionaire anymore? Looking at the wedding photos, I realized that Elena and I had both been trying to love edited versions of each other. She'd fallen for someone who didn't exist. I'd fallen for someone who was performing. Neither of us had been brave enough to risk being completely known. Asterisk, asterisk, the charity donation receipt for $5 million sat on my desk beside Elena's wedding photos, representing a choice I'd made about who I wanted to become in the aftermath of our destruction. The Chen Foundation for Financial Literacy had been my way of transforming our private failure into something constructive, teaching financial independence to young adults from low-income families. Read the mission statement I'd crafted with help from nonprofit consultants. If Elena's story had taught me anything, it was that financial anxiety could poison even the most well-intentioned relationships. Maybe I could help other people avoid the desperation that had driven her choices. My assistant Jennifer had initially questioned the timing of such a public charitable initiative. "Sir," she'd said carefully, "some people might see this as a response to the negative coverage about Ms. Elena." She'd been right, but not in the way she'd meant. The foundation wasn't damage control, it was an acknowledgement that Elena's fears had been rational. In a world where financial security remained elusive for most people, her strategy of seeking a provider wasn't shallow. It was survival. I could use my resources to address the root cause rather than judge the symptom. The first program would provide free financial planning workshops in communities like the one where Elena had grown up. Participants would learn about budgeting, investing, and building emergency fund skills that could provide the security Elena had sought through relationships. "We're not just teaching money management," I'd explained to the foundation's board during our inaugural meeting. "We're teaching emotional independence. When people feel financially secure, they can make relationship choices based on love rather than survival." The work had given me purpose beyond quarterly earnings reports and expansion strategies. For the first time in years, I was building something that didn't primarily benefit me, and the satisfaction was unexpected. Elena, according to mutual friends, had taken a different path toward healing. She'd left San Francisco for Portland, where her cousin had helped her find a position with a progressive nonprofit focused on women's economic empowerment. The irony wasn't lost on me that we'd both gravitated toward work addressing the very issues that had destroyed our relationship. David had been my primary source of information about Elena's new life, sharing updates with the careful neutrality of someone trying to maintain friendships with both parties in a complicated breakup. "She seems different," he'd told me during a recent dinner. "More focused, more confident. She's been taking night classes in nonprofit management and talking about eventually starting her own organization." I'd found myself genuinely glad to hear about her progress, though the updates came with a bittersweet ache. The Elena who was building her own career in financial independence was the woman I'd hoped to find beneath all the performance and anxiety. We'd needed to destroy each other to become the people who might have actually worked together. The media attention had largely faded. Moving on to fresher scandals and newer outrages, occasionally someone would recognize me and make a comment about that relationship story. But mostly, I'd return to the anonymous wealth I'd cultivated before. Forbes had made me temporarily famous. My dating life remained non-existent. Kim had suggested I take time to work on myself before attempting another serious relationship, and I'd discovered that being alone wasn't as frightening as I'd once thought. The desperate loneliness that had driven me to create elaborate tests had been replaced by something more: sustainable, genuine self-knowledge, and the beginning of self-acceptance. "The next person you date," Dr. Kim had said, "should meet the real Marcus from day one. No testing, no performance, no strategic revelation of information. Just honest communication about who you are and what you want." The concept was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Being completely known meant being completely vulnerable to rejection, but it also meant any acceptance would be authentic. Elena had taught me that love built on deception, no matter how well-intentioned, was doomed to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Whatever came next would have to be built on a foundation of truth, even if that truth was more fragile than the careful constructions we'd both preferred. Asterisk. The charity gala invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Elegant cream cards announcing the Portland Women's Economic Empowerment Coalition's annual fundraiser. I'd almost declined black tie events, had lost their appeal since becoming tabloid fodder. But the cause aligned perfectly with the Chen Foundation's mission. I hadn't expected to see Elena there. She stood near the silent auction display, examining a donated weekend at a Napa Valley vineyard. With the focused attention I remembered from our early dates, 6 months had changed her in subtle but noticeable ways. Her hair was shorter, styled in a confident bob that made her look more professional. She wore a simple black dress that was elegant without being expensive, and she carried herself with a poise that seemed earned rather than performed. For a moment, I considered leaving before she noticed me. Our last conversation had ended with mutual understanding but no resolution, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for a chance encounter in such a public setting. But Elena looked up before I could retreat, her eyes meeting mine across the crowded ballroom. Her expression cycled through surprise, uncertainty, and something that might have been warmth, before settling into a cautious smile. She approached me with the measured steps of someone who'd rehearsed this possibility in her mind. "Marcus," she said, extending her hand in a gesture that was both formal and safe. "I didn't expect to see you here." Elena. I took her hand briefly, noting the absence of rings and the calluses that suggested she'd been doing physical work. "You look well." "Thank you. You too." She glanced around the elegant venue, her voice carrying a note of professional pride. "This is actually my event. I'm the new development director for the coalition," Bat explained, her confident bearing. Elena had found her element, working in a field that aligned with her values while providing the financial stability she'd always sought. "Congratulations," I said, and meant it. "David mentioned you'd moved to Portland. How are you finding it?" "Different from San Francisco," she replied, her tone warming slightly. "Smaller, more collaborative. People here seem less impressed by wealth and more interested in impact." The irony in her words wasn't lost on either of us, but neither of us acknowledged it directly. "I've been following the Chen Foundation's work," Elena continued. "The financial literacy programs are impressive. Very needed. Thank you. Hoping to expand to Portland next year, actually. The economic demographics here suggest there's significant demand." We stood there for a moment. Two people who'd once planned a life together now, discussing our separate missions with professional courtesy. The conversation felt surreal polite, measured almost businesslike, despite the emotional history between us. "Would you like to see what we've accomplished here?" Elena asked, gesturing toward a display board featuring the coalition's recent initiatives. "I'm proud of what we've built," as she walked me through their programs: microloan initiatives for women starting businesses, financial planning workshops for single mothers, mentorship programs connecting established professionals with young entrepreneurs. I could see the passion that had been missing from her previous work. "This is remarkable," I said, studying statistics showing measurable improvements in participants' financial stability. "You've created real systemic change." Elena's smile was genuinely warm for the first time all evening. "It turns out that, when you give people tools instead of just hoping someone will rescue them, they can build pretty amazing things." The comment was directed at her past self as much as at me, an acknowledgement of growth that didn't require explicit apology or explanation. "I learned something important after everything fell apart," she continued, her voice becoming more personal. "Financial security isn't something you find in another person, it's something you build in yourself. Once I stopped looking for someone to provide it and started creating it, everything changed." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I learned something similar. Trust isn't something you test, it's something you build through consistent honesty." Elena studied my face, perhaps gauging whether this conversation was safe to continue. "Do you think we could have learned those lessons together?" she asked quietly. "If we'd been brave enough to be honest from the beginning." It was the question that had haunted me for months. I considered it carefully before answering. "Maybe," I said finally, "but maybe we needed to fail completely before we could succeed separately. Maybe some lessons can only be learned alone." Elena nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than sad. "I have wondered about that too. Whether we were always going to self-destruct, or whether different choices could have led to different outcomes." The evening's program began before either of us could explore that question further, but we found ourselves seated at adjacent tables during dinner. Throughout the speeches and presentations, I found myself watching Elena as she networked with donors and volunteers. Seeing the confidence and competence she'd developed in her new role, she'd become the person I'd hoped to find beneath all the anxiety and performance, someone building her own success rather than seeking it through others. The irony was that this version of Elena, secure in her own accomplishments, was exactly the kind of partner I could have trusted completely. But that trust would have to remain theoretical. We were different people now, shaped by the lessons our failure had taught us. But those lessons had also moved us onto separate paths that seemed unlikely to converge again. Asterisk. The handwritten thank you note arrived 2 days after the Portland gala, delivered to my San Francisco office in Elena. Familiar script? The envelope was simple cream paper, no return address, but I recognized her handwriting immediately. Dear Marcus, it began. I've started this letter a dozen times over the past 6 months, never finding the right words to express what I needed to say after seeing you in Portland. I finally know what those words are. I set the letter aside for a moment, pouring myself coffee before settling into my office chair to read what felt like the conclusion to a story that had been unfinished for too long. Thank you for the most painful and necessary lesson of my life. When you exposed my deceptions at that coffee shop, I felt angry and humiliated. I spent weeks crafting justifications for my behavior, building elaborate explanations for why my choices had been reasonable under the circumstances. I was the victim, I told myself. You were the manipulator who'd created an impossible test. But, as the anger faded and the media attention died down, I was left with the uncomfortable truth that you'd been right about me. I had been looking for someone to rescue me from my own financial fears rather than facing them directly. I had been treating relationships as transactions where love was secondary to security. Moving to Portland forced me to confront who I'd become. Without the possibility of running back to you, without the safety net of hoping our relationship could be salvaged, I had to build a life based on my own capabilities rather than someone else's resources. The work I'm doing now with the coalition has shown me what I was really seeking all along, not a wealthy partner, but financial independence. The security I tried to find through relationships, I have finally found through my own efforts. For the first time in my adult life, I can pay my bills without anxiety, plan for the future without fear, and make relationship choices based on love, rather than survival. I understand now why you felt the need to test me. You'd been burned before by people who loved your wallet more than your character, and you wanted to know if I was different. The tragic irony is that I could have been different if I'd been brave enough to build my own success instead of seeking yours. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness, though I hope you found a way to forgive me anyway. I'm writing to tell you that your test, cruel as it felt at the time, was exactly what I needed. You forced me to confront the worst parts of myself, and in doing so, you gave me the chance to become better. I hope you've learned to trust without testing, just as I've learned to love without calculating. We both deserved better than the relationship we built on mutual deception, but maybe that relationship was necessary to help us become people capable of building something real with someone else. I saw the announcement about the Chen Foundation's expansion to Portland. If you ever need a local contact for your financial literacy programs, the coalition would welcome the partnership. I think we could do good work together as colleagues this time, built on the honesty we should have started with. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go when holding on would have been easier. Thank you for showing me that some forms of security can't be given, they have to be earned. I wish you genuine happiness and authentic love. Always grateful. ELENAPS. I paid off my credit cards last month, all of them. It felt better than any engagement ring ever could. I set the letter down and walked to my office window, looking out at the San Francisco skyline where Elena and I had once walked together, dreaming of a future that had been doomed from the start by our own fears and deceptions. Her words carried no expectation of response, no hidden agenda or request for reconciliation. They were simply the thoughts of someone who'd found clarity on the other side of destruction, offering closure to a story that had needed an ending. I found myself smiling at her postscript about the credit cards. The woman who'd pawned her watch to pay rent had become someone who could eliminate debt through her own earnings, a transformation that represented more than financial progress. It represented the kind of personal growth that made real love possible. Elena had given me something precious in her letter: absolution. Not for my deception, which had been wrong regardless of my motivations, but for the painful necessity of our failure. She'd helped me understand that some relationships exist to teach rather than to last, to break us open so we can be rebuilt into better versions of ourselves. I walked to my desk and pulled out a piece of paper, beginning my own response not to Elena, but to the man I'd been when our relationship started. It was time to forgive him too. The new business partnership agreement sat on my desk next to Elena's letter, representing a different kind of future than I had once imagined. Dr. Sarah Kim, my therapist who'd helped me navigate the aftermath of my public relationship disaster, was launching her own practice focused on helping high-net-worth individuals manage the psychological challenges of wealth. I want to create a space where successful people can address the loneliness, the trust issues, and the relationship difficulties that often come with financial success. She'd explained during our final session, "Your story, Marcus, isn't unique. It's just rarely discussed publicly." I'd agreed to be a silent partner in her practice, providing funding and business guidance while she focused on the clinical work. It felt like a natural evolution of everything I'd learned about wealth, relationships, and the importance of authentic connection. The Chen Foundation had also evolved beyond financial literacy. expanding to include workshops on healthy relationship dynamics and communication skills. Elena's insight about financial security, enabling better relationship choices, had become a cornerstone of our programming. My personal life had changed too, though more gradually. I'd started dating again, honestly, with Dr. Kim's guidance about healthy vulnerability. I'd met Maria through volunteer work at a food bank, where her dedication to serving others had impressed me long before. I'd learned she was a successful pediatric surgeon building her own foundation. Our first conversation had lasted 3 hours, covering everything from childhood dreams to career disappointments to fears about balancing professional success with personal fulfillment. I'd told her about my wealth on our second date, explaining both the opportunities and complications it created. I appreciate your honesty, she'd said simply. I make good money myself, so I'm not looking for someone to take care of me financially, but I am looking for someone who can be emotionally present and authentic. Money is just money, character is what matters. It was the response I'd hoped for from Elena, but had never received. Partly because I'd never given her the chance to offer it. Maria and I were taking things slowly, building trust through consistent honesty rather than elaborate tests. The relationship felt different from anything I'd experienced, lighter, more natural, built on who we actually were rather than who we thought the other person wanted us to be. Elena had been right in her letter about learning to love without calculating. With Maria, I'd discovered what that felt like, making choices based on genuine compatibility rather than strategic considerations. Sharing vulnerabilities without wondering how they'd be used against me. The Forbes list came out again last year, this time ranking me at number 743. The number felt less important than it once had. A useful metric for business purposes, but irrelevant to my sense of self. I'd learned to separate Marcus, the CEO, from Marcus, the man, understanding that while they were connected, they didn't have to be identical. Elena had sent a brief congratulations text when the new list was published. Saw the Forbes ranking, congratulations, on continued success in business and in life. It was signed with just her initial, a friendly but distant acknowledgement from someone who'd moved fully into her own story. I'd heard through mutual friends that she'd gotten engaged to a fellow nonprofit director, someone she'd met through work who shared her passion for economic justice. David had shown me a photo from their engagement party, Lena glowing with genuine happiness, wearing a modest ring she'd probably helped choose, surrounded by friends who knew and loved the real version of herself. It was the ending she deserved, and the one I'd unknowingly prepared her for, through our spectacular failure. Looking back now, I understand that Elena and I were both seeking the same thing, love that could survive external pressures. We'd just approached it from opposite directions, each testing the other's commitment in ways that made genuine commitment impossible. Our relationship had been a necessary disaster, teaching us both lessons we couldn't have learned any other way. Elena had discovered that financial security comes from within. I'd learned that emotional security requires complete honesty. We'd both found the authentic love we'd been seeking, just not with each other. Sometimes the greatest gift to people can give each other is the wisdom that comes from breaking apart completely, then using those pieces to build something better with someone else. I keep Elena's thank you note in my desk drawer, next to those original incorporation papers that started my journey toward wealth. They're both reminders of where I've been and how far I've traveled financially, emotionally, and spiritually. Today, when people ask me about love and money, I tell them what Elena and I learned the hard way. Honesty isn't a luxury in relationships. The foundation, everything else, including love itself, can be built on that foundation. But without it, even the strongest feelings will eventually crumble under the weight of deception. The truth, I've discovered, really can set you free even when it first breaks your heart.